Listen, there's one image from this account that I keep coming back to, and it's not the thing outside the tent. It's the safety pin. Marcus had threaded it through the zipper pull himself, his own habit, something he'd read on a form about keeping raccoons out. And when he woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of the zipper moving, slowly, deliberately, from the outside, the first thing he did was look at his hands, both flat on the ground mat. Then he looked at the zipper. It had moved 3 inches. The pin was still clipped. He finished his through hike 11 months later. He has never camped alone since. But to understand what happened that night on the ridge above Waynesboro, you have to understand why he was there alone in the first place, and what the man at the outfitter told him before he ever reached the trailhead. Marcus was 34 years old and had just lost a logistics job he'd held for 9 years, not fired exactly. The department was dissolved, and he was given 2 weeks of severance and a handshake from someone he'd never met. He went home, sat in his apartment for 4 days, and then decided he needed to go somewhere that didn't have his email on it. He'd done day hikes before, a few overnights with friends in his late 20s, but never a solo trip, never anything multi-day, never the AT. He picked a section of the Central Virginia corridor because a coworker had once mentioned it was beautiful in early October, and because it was close enough to drive to in an afternoon. He stopped at an outfitter in Waynesboro to pick up a few things he'd forgotten: a stuff sack, a replacement sleeping pad strap, a better headlamp. The man behind the counter was older, maybe late 60s, the kind of person who didn't waste words. He had a scar across the back of his left hand and was missing the top joint of his index finger on the right. He rang Marcus up without much conversation. Then, when Marcus mentioned the ridge he'd planned to camp on the first night, the man set the bag down on the counter and looked at him for a moment. "You staying on the White Blazes?" Marcus said yes. "Don't camp off trail up there." He picked the bag back up. "And if something calls your name up there after dark, don't answer it." Marcus laughed a little. The man did not. Marcus told himself it was local color. Everybody in mountain country had a warning for somebody, and they were almost always about bears, or weather, or staying on marked trails, which, wrapped in a little folklore, sounded more dramatic than it was. He drove to the trailhead with the bag on the passenger seat and the man's face still sitting somewhere at the back of his mind. He parked at 4:20 in the afternoon. The lot was half gravel, half mud from recent rain, and his was the only car there. He checked his paper map 3 times before he locked the car. Not because he was nervous, but because his paper map was a habit, the same way the safety pin through the zipper was a habit. He was a practical person. He liked systems. He made camp in a small depression just off the main trail, close enough to hear anyone passing but not visible from the path itself. The tent went up cleanly. Bear canister hung correctly on a limb about 12 feet out. Boots inside the vestibule. Safety pin through the pull. He heated water on his camp stove, ate something from a pouch that was supposed to be chili, and finished the last third of a gas station thermos of coffee that had gone cold somewhere around Front Royal. He texted his sister a rough location before the signal dropped at 8:47. 1 bar to nothing in the span of half a mile. He'd noticed that driving in. It was quiet in the way that the Virginia mountains can be quiet in early October. Not silent exactly. A creek somewhere below him, close enough to hear but not to see. Wind moving through the upper branches in long, slow pulls. The ordinary sounds of a forest doing ordinary things. He was inside the tent by 9, reading on his phone until the battery anxiety kicked in and he put it away. He fell asleep faster than he expected. The first thing that woke him was movement in the leaves. Not wind, the upper branches had gone still. This was lower, ground level, roughly 30 feet from the tent. and it had the stop-start rhythm of something large moving and then pausing. He lay there and listened. It stopped for a long moment, then moved again, then stopped. He told himself deer. Black bears did this too, that same uncertain movement pattern when they caught a human scent and couldn't locate the source. The food was properly hung. He was fine. He wasn't wrong to think that. It was a completely reasonable explanation. The AT corridor through that section of Virginia had documented bear activity, and deer were everywhere in October. The creek was close enough that animals would be moving toward water after dark. There was nothing impossible about what he heard. He didn't open the tent. He was almost back to sleep when the sound moved. Not toward him, but up the slope above him. That was the part that registered and then didn't. The way things register in the almost asleep place and then dissolve before you can examine them. Whatever it was above the tent now, on the slope, not below by the creek where he'd first heard it. He filed that away and lost it to sleep. He woke again at 1 a.m. or close to it. His watch said 12:58. The difference this time was the silence. Total, complete, and wrong. The creek was gone, not quieter, gone. Like someone had turned a dial. No insect sound, no wind, no small branches ticking in the cold. He lay on his back and stared at the tent ceiling and did not move. He waited. He counted his own breaths, which was something he hadn't done since childhood. 1 minute became 2. Nothing. He was on the edge of convincing himself that he'd simply entered a quieter period of the night, that the creek had dropped behind the wind and his ears were adjusting when he heard it. A single footstep on wet leaves from the slope above the tent. Not an animal placing its weight tentatively. One deliberate, human weight footstep, and then nothing. He held completely still. He stopped counting breaths. He waited for a second step that didn't come. The silence continued for what felt like a long time. Long enough that his shoulders started to unknot. Long enough that the rational part of his brain began reassembling a reasonable explanation. Hiker moving after dark. Another camper he hadn't seen. An animal that happened to step in a way that sounded human on the wet leaves. Long enough that his hand moved away from the knife on the ground mat and settled flat again. He told himself, deer. A single deer moving across the ridge, one hoof on wet ground, and then gone into the trees. He almost believed it. He was good at almost believing things. What he didn't think about until later, much later, when he wrote up the account and sent it in, was that the footstep had stopped at exactly the moment he stopped breathing. Not after, not before. At the same moment as if whatever was on the slope had been listening to him just as carefully as he was listening to it. He fell back into shallow sleep somewhere after 1 in the morning, sitting half upright with his back against his pack. The footstep that stopped when he stopped breathing. That was the detail. That was what didn't sit right. Not the sound itself, the timing. He was awake before he knew why. Not the gradual surface of normal sleep where the room comes back to you in pieces. This was immediate. Eyes open, body still. The specific kind of conscious that only arrives when something has already happened, and the sound of it is still in the air. He was on his back, both hands flat on the ground mat. The tent was dark except for the faint gray that wasn't quite light yet and wasn't quite nothing. Then he heard it again, the zipper, moving. Slow and deliberate, with the particular sound of metal teeth separating one at a time from the outside. He did not sit up. He did not reach for the headlamp. His eyes went to the zipper pull out of reflex, even in the dark. And what he registered, what his brain processed in the first flat second, was that the safety pin was still clipped, still threaded through the pull, still exactly where he'd put it before sleep. And the zipper was still moving, 3 inches, maybe 4, opening from the bottom of the main panel, working upward. He watched it stop. The silence that followed was different from the silence after the footstep. That silence had felt like waiting. This silence felt like listening. Marcus did not breathe. He was aware of that consciously, the specific decision not to breathe, made without thinking about it, the same way you hold still when something large is very close. He lay flat, both palms on the mat. He counted the seconds the way he'd counted his breaths earlier, and he got to 11 before he understood that whatever was on the other side of the tent fabric knew he was awake. He didn't know how he knew that. He just did. Then, through the fabric, single-wall tent, the cheap kind, the kind where the material between you and the outside is about as thick as a decent jacket, he heard breathing. Not a sound like breathing. Breathing. A single exhalation, low and slow, close enough that he could hear the moisture in it, the way you can hear someone breathe in a quiet room when their mouth is near your ear. Except there was a tent between them. Except there was nothing outside that tent that should have been there. He did not answer it, did not say anything, did not call out to ask who was there. He remembered the man at the outfitter without deciding to, the way you remember a thing when the situation catches up to the warning, and the warning suddenly sounds less like local color and more like information. Don't answer it. He pressed both palms harder against the mat, as if that did anything. He counted. He had gotten to 60 twice, 2 full minutes, when the silence changed again. Not a sound marking the change. Something else. The absence of a presence, if that makes any sense, which Marcus admitted in his account that it probably didn't, and that he wasn't sure how to describe it more accurately. The forest exhaled. That was the closest he could get. The insects came back first, a thin sound at the edge of hearing. Then the creak returned, distant and low, exactly where it had been before it disappeared. The temperature seemed to drop a degree, as if something warm had been close and was no longer. He stayed on his back until the gray at the tent seams turned pale blue and then white. He did not sleep again. He sat upright with his back against his pack and his hand on his knife, and he watched the tent ceiling go from dark to gray to the particular flat white of early morning on an overcast day, and he waited for a sound that didn't come. When the light was good enough to see by, he unzipped the tent from the inside. The safety pin was still clipped. He worked it free, pulled the zipper down, and pushed the rain fly back. The air outside was cold and damp and completely ordinary. Birds, the creek, wind in the high branches. The campsite looked exactly as he'd left it. Bare canister hanging correctly, cook kit next to the tent, cold ash where he hadn't bothered with a fire. Nothing moved or missing. He almost convinced himself it had been a dream. Then he looked at the ground. The soil around the tent had softened overnight from the drizzle that had come through after midnight. Soft enough to hold an impression. He could see the marks his own boots had made setting up camp the evening before, each tread pattern clear and deep. He could see where he'd walked to the canister line and back. Beside the vestibule, the little covered entrance where your boots sit, where you crouch to pull on your socks in the morning, there was one impression. Not a boot, no tread. A footprint, sort of, in the softest part of the mud where the drip line from the rain fly had fallen and pooled. Longer than a human foot, or about the same length but different in proportion, with the toes, if they were toes, more widely spaced than a human foot would leave. It was facing the tent, facing inward, toward the opening. There was no second print anywhere near it, not behind it, not beside it. One impression, facing the tent door, in mud soft enough to hold every detail. Marcus photographed it with his cracked phone screen. The photo was not great. Bad light, shaky hands, angle slightly off. You could see the impression. You could see it wasn't a boot. Whether you could say with certainty what made it was another question, and Marcus was the first to admit that. He packed up camp without making coffee. He rolled the sleeping pad, stuffed the tent, broke down the cook kit, and shouldered his pack in a sequence that was faster than his usual morning routine and quieter than it too. He didn't have a reason to be quiet. He was quiet anyway. He reached the next shelter by 9 in the morning. There was a family there, 2 adults and a teenage kid, eating oatmeal at the picnic table. The normalcy of it, the bright orange rain jacket, the camp stove hissing, the kid complaining about blisters, hit him harder than he expected. He signed the trail register. Under notes, he wrote, "Clear night, slight drizzle after midnight." Nothing about what he'd heard. Nothing about the impression in the mud. He hiked the remaining section over the next 5 days without incident. Nothing unusual on the trail, nothing in the campsites. He watched the woods the whole time. That particular kind of watching where you're not looking for anything specific but your eyes keep moving. But there was nothing to find. He told no one. Not his sister, who texted twice to check in. Not the co-worker who'd recommended the section. Not anyone, until 10 months later when he typed it up and sent it anonymously to a submissions address he found on a forum thread about unexplained trail encounters. The thing he kept coming back to, he wrote at the end of the account, was not the zipper and not the breathing and not even the impression in the mud. It was the safety pin. He had put it through the zipper pull himself. He knew how it worked. And whatever worked the zipper from outside had not moved the pin, had not tried to move the pin. It had moved the zipper body directly, pushed the teeth apart from the outside, which is not how zippers are designed to be opened, which is not something a gloved hand does cleanly, which is not something an animal paw accomplishes at all. He still pins his zipper shut every night. He just doesn't camp alone anymore. The next account came from someone who had spent 11 years on the trail, not as a hiker, but as a ranger. And he said the strangest thing he ever encountered wasn't in the woods. It was in a trail register. Dale M. spent 11 years as a ranger on the AT corridor in southwestern Virginia before he retired. And he is the kind of person who is careful with language. When he agreed to share this account, he said 2 things at the start of the conversation. First, that he had filed an official incident report at the time, and that the report was accurate as far as it went. Second, that the report did not fully capture what bothered him about it. He said those 2 things were not contradictory. He said a report captures what you can document. It doesn't capture what you sit with afterward. The incident happened in his 9th year on the corridor, late October, a Thursday, following a blowdown closure that had kept a 4-mile section of trail shut for 8 days after a storm pushed 3 large oaks across the path and took out a water bar on the steepest part of the grade. Dale had spent 2 days that week clearing debris with a volunteer crew, and on the Thursday he was doing a solo patrol of the reopened section, walking it end to end, checking the blazes, making sure the signage was back in order, noting anything the crew had missed. He found the trail in reasonable shape. One drainage still needed attention. A blaze on a birch tree had been partially obscured by bark peel and needed repainting. He made notes. He drank bad coffee from a dented thermos he'd owned since his first year on the job. Routine work, the kind that fills most of a ranger's days, and that Dale had always found satisfying in a quiet way. He knew this section of trail the way you know the layout of your own house, the places where the grade steepened without warning, the rock outcrop where hikers like to stop and eat lunch, the hollow where the wind always came from the wrong direction. The register box was at the southern end of the section, mounted on a post near the junction with a fire road. Dale checked it as a matter of course on every patrol. He opened the metal box, pulled out the logbook, and started reading from the last entry forward. There were 3 entries from before the closure, the last one dated 9 days ago. Then a gap, which made sense. The trail had been shut. Then 2 entries from hikers who had come through in the 2 days since reopening. He read those, noted nothing unusual, and was about to close the book when he turned back one more page out of habit. And there it was, an entry dated 6 days into the closure period, when the trail had been officially shut and the access points were signed and gated. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. The entry gave a name, a common enough name, the kind that appears in a lot of registers, and a hometown in western North Carolina. Under notes it said, "Came through ahead of schedule. Everything quiet up here." Dale stood there for a moment. He was practical. His first thought was that a hiker had come through before the gates went up, or had found a way around them. It happened, especially with section hikers who had tight schedules and didn't always check for closures. He made a radio note of it, logged the date discrepancy in his field book, and continued the patrol. He told himself it was an access violation at most. Paperwork issue, he'd seen it before. What he didn't tell himself, not yet, was that the name and the hometown had caught on something in his memory. A small snag, like a splinter you don't notice until you press on it. He couldn't place it on the trail, walking back to his truck. He ate his lunch at the vehicle. He drove the service road back toward the station. And somewhere on that drive, on a gravel road through a section of hollow where the trees close in close enough that you drive with the windows up even in good weather, it came to him. He had read a missing hiker file 2 years before. A hiker who had gone missing on this exact section of trail. A 4-year-old case, officially listed as a lost hiker, never resolved. He had read the file during a search refresher. They reviewed old cases every couple of years, partly for training, partly because the trail had a long memory and occasionally turned something up. The name in the file. The hometown in the file. Western North Carolina. He did not radio it in immediately. He drove to the station and pulled the physical file himself. He wanted to be certain before he said anything to anyone, because he was careful with language and because making a claim like that a missing person's name had appeared in a trail register during a period when the trail was closed, required certainty. He sat at his desk with the file open and the logbook entry photographed on his phone, and he compared them. Same name, same hometown. Same phrasing that meant nothing on its own, came through ahead of schedule, and that Dale told himself could be coincidence right up until he got to the second thing. He went back further in the file. Read the last known register entry the missing hiker had made 4 years ago, 3 days before he was reported overdue. It was logged in a shelter register 30 miles north of where Dale stood, and it said, "Came through ahead of schedule. Everything quiet up here, word for word." Dale set the file down. He sat with that for a while. He filed a report. He listed it accurately. Unauthorized register entry during closure period. Possible trespassing, name and entry text noted. He did not include his comparison to the missing hiker file in the main report because he could not document it as anything other than a coincidence of phrasing, and Dale did not put unverifiable things in official documents. He mentioned it verbally to his supervisor, who listened, nodded, and said it was probably a hiker who'd read the same shelter register at some point and picked up the phrasing. Hikers did that. Trail culture had its own language. That was a reasonable explanation. Dale did not argue with it. What he did not mention in the report, and what he told us only after some consideration, was what happened that evening. He was driving the last service road check of the day, the one that ran along the eastern boundary of the corridor and passed within a quarter-mile of the old fire tower at the north end of his patrol section. The tower had been decommissioned 3 years earlier. The observation deck was still structurally sound, but the access was locked. Padlock on the gate at the base, padlock on the tower door at the top. Dale had both keys on his ring. He checked the tower twice a year for vandalism and weather damage. Other than that, it sat empty. He saw the light from the service road. Not a bright light, a warm, low, amber glow in the observation window. The kind of light a kerosene lantern makes. Dale pulled over and sat in the truck for a moment watching it. Then he drove to the gate. The padlock on the gate was locked. His key opened it. He drove up the access track and parked at the base of the tower. The padlock on the tower door was locked. His key opened it. He climbed the stairs, which were metal and narrow, and made enough noise that anyone inside would have heard him coming from the first landing. The observation room was empty. Nothing disturbed. No sign of entry through any of the windows, which were latched from the inside the way he'd left them at his last inspection. The old equipment was where it always was. The folding chair in the corner, the rolled survey maps. And in the center of the observation table, not on the shelf beside the window where it always sat, where it had sat for 3 years since the tower went dark, the old kerosene lantern. Moved, placed deliberately in the exact center of the table, wick trimmed, glass chimney seated correctly. Dale put his hand near the chimney without touching it. It was warm. He stood in that room for a while. The amber light from outside was gone. The lantern was unlit when he arrived, when he climbed the stairs, when he opened the door. Whatever glow he'd seen from the service road was not coming from the tower by the time he reached it. He checked his timeline. 4 minutes, maybe 5, from when he pulled over to when he climbed to the observation room. Long enough to drive up, unlock 2 padlocks, climb 2 flights of stairs. Not long enough for a person to light a lantern, let it burn long enough to warm the chimney glass, extinguish it, and leave the tower through a locked door. He filed a second report, listed it accurately. Unauthorized entry suspected, lantern repositioned, chimney warm, no subject located. His supervisor noted it. Probably kids who got in before the gate, got spooked when they heard the truck. Dale signed the report. He thought about something an older ranger had told him years back. A man who'd been on the trail corridor for 30 years before Dale arrived, and who had, in Dale's estimation, better judgment about the land than anyone he'd ever met. He used to say, "Some parts of the trail remember the people who died on them. Don't encourage the remembering." Dale had always filed that under grief talking. The way people who worked a piece of land long enough started to give it a kind of personality, a kind of memory, because it was easier than sitting with the things that happened on it and went unresolved. He retired 2 years after the lantern. He didn't say the 2 things were connected. He was careful with language, but he kept the photograph of the register entry on his phone until the phone died, and he never transferred it to the new one. The third account is different. It's not from a ranger or a hiker with an anonymous submission. It came from a family, and the detail they can't explain isn't what they saw. It's what they heard. Rena is 41 years old, and she tells this story carefully, the way people tell stories they've gone over many times in their own heads and still haven't found a clean place to set down. She doesn't present it as proof of anything. She presents it as what happened to her brother, which is a different thing. And she says the reason she finally submitted it was that she found 2 other accounts online from the same general section of trail describing the same sound. And she thought someone should know that her brother's experience wasn't isolated. Her brother Kevin was 28 when it happened. He's 34 now, and according to Rena, he still hikes, still loves the trail, and has never fully explained to anyone outside the immediate family why he no longer responds when someone calls his name from behind him on a path. He just keeps walking until whoever it is catches up. Kevin was a strong hiker. He'd done the Nantahala section of the AT in western North Carolina several times. A 12-mile loop he knew well enough that he didn't bother with a GPS, just a paper map folded in his hip pocket that he rarely unfolded. He started early, usually beat the heat, and was back at his truck by early afternoon. The kind of hike that feels almost domestic when you've done it enough times. Familiar ground. He started at the trailhead at 7 in the morning on a Saturday in late July. His phone was at 31% because he'd forgotten to charge it the night before. Not a big concern on a day hike he'd done before, on a trail he knew, with a planned return by 2 or 3 in the afternoon. He filled his water filter at the first creek crossing, ate a handful of trail mix on the log bridge at mile 2, and made good time on the uphill section before the ridge. At the junction where the main trail met an unmarked path heading uphill into the hollow, he paused. He'd seen the junction before, but he'd never paid it much attention. This time, he noticed the sign, hand-painted on a board, nailed to a tree at eye level, the paint old enough to be peeling at the edges. It read, "Stay on trail," which was reasonable enough advice at any junction. He glanced up the unmarked path. It disappeared quickly into the hollow, steep and overgrown and clearly not maintained. His map showed nothing there. He continued on the main trail. 3 miles past the junction, on a section of path that ran along a ridgeline with the hollow dropping away steeply on his left, Kevin heard his name. He stopped walking. It came from his left, from below, from the direction of the hollow. A male voice. Clear and distinct, not muffled or distant. Just his name, once, the way you'd call someone you'd spotted across a parking lot. He stood on the trail and looked toward the sound. Trees, slope, shadow, nothing moving. He waited maybe 30 seconds, called back once. Hey, anyone there kind of call, the kind you make when you're almost certain it was nothing but feel slightly foolish not acknowledging it. No response. The hollow was quiet. He told himself it was a hiker on some connecting path he didn't know about, or sound carrying strangely through the gap. The terrain in that section was irregular. The hollow created a kind of natural funnel, and voices did strange things in funnel geography. He'd read that somewhere. He kept walking. He ate lunch at a rock outcrop at mile 7, refilled his water, checked his phone. 19%. He sent a brief text to Rena, at the halfway point, weather good, and kept moving on the descent toward the second creek crossing. 2 miles below the lunch rock, on the descent, he heard it again. This time, he stopped walking before he'd consciously decided to, the way the body sometimes processes information before the brain catches up. The voice was closer. Same direction, from the left, from the hollow side of the trail, but closer than it had any right to be given the terrain between him and the hollow floor. And this time, it wasn't just his name. It was the version of his name that his father used. Not Kevin. The shortened form, the specific 2-syllable version that his father had called him since childhood, the one that Kevin's friends didn't know, that his co-workers didn't know, that existed only inside a certain radius of home. He stood on the trail and did not call back. The woods on the hollow side were still. No movement in the canopy, no sound of someone pushing through brush toward the trail, no follow-up call. Just that voice, that specific sound, and then the ordinary noise of the forest resuming around it. Birds, wind, the creek somewhere below him, getting louder as he descended. He called his father. His phone was at 14% and the signal was thin, but it connected on the third attempt. His father answered from the house. He'd been home all day, wasn't planning to go anywhere. Had a broken leg from a fall 2 weeks prior, and was spending most of his time in the recliner with a bag of frozen peas. He said Kevin's name when he answered, the full version, and then the short version, the familiar greeting, and Kevin heard the difference immediately and completely. It was not what he had heard in the hollow. The voice in the hollow had his father's register, his father's cadence, the specific way his father clipped the second syllable. But hearing his father's actual voice on the phone, Kevin understood that the thing in the hollow had gotten something wrong. Something in the timing. Something in the breath behind the sound. Close enough to recognize. Not close enough to be right. He ended the call at 12% battery and kept moving. He did not stop to examine the hollow side of the trail. He did not try to locate a path down to the hollow floor. He was not frightened in a way that he would have described as fear, exactly. It was more like the very specific alertness of a person who has just understood that a situation is different from what they thought it was, and who has not yet decided what to do with that understanding. He moved at a steady pace. He stayed on the white blazes. He reached the junction with the unmarked path at mile 10, heading back out. He was going to walk past it. Then he looked at the sign. It said, "Trail closed." He stopped and looked at it for a long time. The same board, the same nail in the same tree, the same peeling paint, the same faded color, the same weathering that told him the sign had been there for years. He was certain as he was of anything that day, that it had said, "Stay on trail," when he passed it going in. He took a photograph with his phone at 9% battery. The photograph showed the board clearly. Trail closed. He did not go up the path. He reached his truck at 2:15 in the afternoon. He sat in the driver's seat for a while before he started the engine. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't in the kind of state that would have worried a bystander. He was just sitting quietly, the way a person sits when they are carefully going back over something and checking each piece of it for an explanation that fits. When he described it to Rena that evening, she remembered something their grandmother had said once, years ago, not about the trail specifically, but about the hollows in that part of the mountains in general. Their grandmother had grown up in western North Carolina and had strong practical opinions about how you behaved in the landscape. One of the things she said, and said plainly, was this: if you hear your name called from a ridge and you don't know the situation, don't answer. Don't yell back, don't whistle back, just keep moving. Their grandmother had said it the way she said everything, not dramatically, not as a warning intended to frighten, but as information. The way you'd tell someone which roads flood in heavy rain, or which neighbors had dogs that ran loose. A practical thing to know. Kevin had not answered. He'd called back once, a general hey, before he understood that the voice had said his actual name. By the second call, the one using the shortened version only his father used, he had not answered at all. Rena said she thinks that mattered. She said she doesn't know why she thinks that, only that she does. The photograph of the sign is on Kevin's phone. He's shown it to a few people. Most of them suggest the most reasonable explanation. He misread it going in, tired from the early start, glanced at it and processed what he expected to see rather than what was there. It was an old sign. Trail closed and stay on trail have similar visual shapes if you're not looking carefully. Brains do that on familiar ground, skip over the details because the pattern already matches. Kevin doesn't argue with that. He just says he's read a lot of trail signs. He says he looked at it twice. What was in the hollow, neither Kevin nor Rena can say. What would have happened if he'd answered the second call, the one with his father's voice, the one with the timing wrong? is a question neither of them asks out loud. Kevin still hikes the AT. He just doesn't respond when something calls his name from off-trail. He keeps walking until whatever it is comes to him. The fourth account is the one that took us the longest to include. Not because of what happened, but because of how ordinary it started. This one came in as an anonymous submission. The sender identified himself only as TW and asked that no other identifying details be included. He provided enough verifiable context, the general region, the date range, the road type, that we were able to confirm the basic geography of the account. What we could not confirm, and what TW acknowledged we would not be able to confirm, was the road itself. That detail will make more sense by the end. TW had spent 4 days section hiking a stretch of the AT in eastern Tennessee. He was experienced, unhurried, and had done solo section hikes in that region before. The account doesn't begin on the trail. It begins on the drive back. He was returning to his motel after finishing the section. Late evening, around 9:30. The kind of tired that sits in your legs and shoulders after several days of elevation change. He had about 40 minutes of driving ahead of him on the main route, but his GPS showed a shortcut that would cut it to roughly 25. A county road cutting through a hollow, rejoining the main highway a few miles south of his motel. 14 minutes, the app said. He turned off. The road was paved for the first quarter mile. Then it became gravel. That wasn't unusual for a county road through a hollow in that part of Tennessee, and TW didn't think much of it. He dropped to 15 miles an hour, the way you do on gravel in the dark, and drove with both hands on the wheel. His headlights picked out the road about 30 feet ahead of him. Beyond that, the hollow was dark, in the specific way that rural hollows are dark. Not just an absence of light, but a presence of something else. Trees pressing in close on both sides. The road a pale stripe between walls of dark. A creek ran alongside the road on the left. He could hear it through the closed windows when he slowed at the first curve. The first curve was a tight left-hander around a rock face, the kind where you slow almost to a stop and ease around without knowing what's on the other side. TW eased around it. His headlights swept the gravel shoulder on the far side. A man was standing there, facing away from the truck. Jeans, dark jacket, no reflective gear, no flashlight. Barefoot on cold gravel. TW registered all of this in the 2 or 3 seconds it took to complete the curve and bring the man into full headlight view. He slowed almost to a stop. The man did not turn around, did not react to the headlights or the engine sound, just stood there on the shoulder, facing the rock face and the dark beyond it, as still as something that had been there a long time. TW looked for a vehicle. Nothing on the road ahead. Nothing pulled onto the narrow shoulder behind the man. No hazard lights anywhere in the dark. He looked for a house set back from the road, a mailbox, a driveway. Nothing visible. He considered stopping, rolling down the window, asking if the man needed help. He slowed enough that stopping was an option. The man did not move, did not turn. The stillness was the thing that decided it. Not threatening, exactly, just absolute, in a way that felt less like a person waiting than a person placed. TW drove on. He told himself, local. Someone who lives out here, knows the road, stepped out for some reason that made sense to him. Eccentric behavior was not the same as dangerous behavior. The road was narrow, and the hollow was dark, and TW was tired, and he wanted to get back to his motel. He drove. His GPS had frozen on the last known position sometime during the curve. The screen showed his location as a blue dot on a gray field. No road visible, no route line. He tapped it. Nothing. He set it on the seat and drove by the road itself, which was straightforward enough. One road, no intersections, hollow on both sides. The second curve came about half a mile later. Another tight bend, this one to the right, the creek crossing under the road through a culvert and continuing on the other side. TW took the curve at the same careful speed. His headlights found the shoulder on the far side. The man was standing there. Same posture, facing away, same jeans, same dark jacket, barefoot. TW's foot came off the accelerator without him deciding to. The truck slowed to a crawl. He looked at the man for a long moment. Then he looked at the road behind him, the straight section he'd just driven, the half-mile of gravel between this curve and the last. No one could have walked that distance in the time it took him to drive it. Not at any pace. Not on bare feet on gravel, in the dark, without TW seeing them in his mirrors. He checked his mirrors. Empty road, dark hollow. The creek somewhere to his right now, the sound of it lower than before. He thought, different person, has to be. Two people, coincidentally similar, both standing on the shoulder of this road at night facing away. It was unlikely, but unlikely things happened. He was tired. The hollow played tricks with distances. He drove on. He drove with his eyes moving between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The mirror showed him nothing but the pale stripe of gravel going dark behind him. The GPS was still frozen. His radio, which had been playing a country station out of Knoxville at low volume, had gone to static somewhere in the second curve. He turned it off. The silence in the truck was total except for the engine and the gravel under the tires. The creek had gone quiet. He noticed that without knowing when it happened, at some point between the second curve and where he was now, the sound of the water had stopped. He was still in the hollow. The creek was still there. He could see the dark line of it through the passenger window when the trees thinned, but he could no longer hear it. His gas light came on. He'd meant to stop in town before taking the shortcut. Quarter tank when he turned off the main road, and he'd told himself it was enough for 14 minutes of driving. He checked his odometer. He'd been on the gravel road for almost 20 minutes. The GPS was useless. He kept driving. The road ahead was straight for a longer section now, the hollow widening slightly, the trees pulling back a few feet on each side. His headlights reached further in the straightaway. He could see the next curve ahead, another left-hander, maybe 200 yards out. He drove toward it at 15 miles an hour. He was halfway to the curve when his headlights found the shoulder on the near side of it, the gravel strip just before the bend where the road began to turn. The man was standing there. Same posture, facing away, the same dark jacket, the same bare feet on cold gravel, the same absolute stillness, but closer to the center of the road this time. Not fully in the lane, on the shoulder still, but near the edge of it, near the line where shoulder became road. Closer than he'd been at either of the previous two curves. TW's hand moved to the door lock without him thinking about it. He heard the click of it engaging. He pressed the key in the ignition, trying the engine, and the truck shuddered once, hard, and stalled. The headlights stayed on. Battery strong. The engine simply stopped, in the specific way an engine stops when it's done, and the truck rolled to a halt on the gravel with the man 20 feet ahead in the beam of the headlights, still facing away, still not moving. TW turned the key. Nothing. Turned it again. A sound, low and incomplete, and then nothing. A third time, nothing. Outside, the hollow was dark beyond the headlight beams. The trees on both sides, the pale gravel, the creek somewhere he could no longer hear. And 20 feet ahead, a barefoot man standing in the road with his back to the truck, in the cold, in the dark, not moving at all. TW's hand was on the key. His other hand was on the door lock, keeping it locked. He had not taken his eyes off the man since the truck stopped. Then the man turned around. TW wrote about the face only once, in the original submission, and then he struck through it. Not deleted, struck through, a single line across the sentence, the way you cross out something you've decided not to say, rather than something you've decided was wrong. What remained in the document, directly after the struck line, was this: "I am not going to put that down. He says it was a face. He says it was almost right. He says he will leave it at that." What he did describe was the decision he made in the moment after the man turned around, which was this: he did not honk, did not get out, did not roll down the window, did not speak. He sat in the stalled truck with his hand on the lock and his eyes on the figure in the headlight beam, and he thought through his options the way a practical person thinks through options when the situation has become something they do not have a category for. The road had a slight downhill grade from where the truck had stalled. He'd noticed it on the drive-in. Gravel roads through hollows tend to follow creek grades, and the creek had been dropping since the second curve. If he put the truck in neutral, he would roll forward. The figure was 20 feet ahead, standing near the shoulder. The road was barely wide enough for the truck with clearance on both sides. Rolling through at low speed, if the figure stayed on the shoulder, was possible. He sat for 2 minutes. He counted them. He did not take his eyes off the figure. The figure did not move toward the truck, did not speak, did not gesture. Stood on the near edge of the shoulder with whatever was wrong about its face turned toward the headlights, and was still in the same way it had been still at every curve. Not the stillness of a person standing, but the stillness of a person who did not need to move because they were already where they intended to be. TW turned the key a fourth time. The engine started. He did not floor it. He drove forward at 5 miles an hour, the same careful speed he'd used on every curve. The figure was on his right, at the shoulder edge. As the truck reached it, the figure stepped back. 1 step, unhurried, enough to clear the mirror. TW did not look to the right as he passed. He did not check the mirror after. He drove until the gravel ended and the road became pavement. He drove until he saw a county road junction with a single overhead light on a wooden pole. The kind of light that throws a yellow circle on the asphalt and leaves everything outside it darker by comparison. He pulled under it and put the truck in park and sat there for 10 minutes without touching the radio. When he felt steady enough to drive, he drove to his motel. He parked under the lot lights and sat in the truck for another few minutes before going inside. He was not shaking. He was not in any state that would have looked unusual to a person passing through the lot. He was simply very still, the way you are when you have used up the kind of energy that stillness costs. In the morning, he noticed the grill. He was loading his bag into the truck when he saw it, a smear across the front grill, wide and dark. The kind of mark that might be mud, except that it was too consistent, too even, spread across 3 or 4 horizontal bars in a single lateral stroke. No dent, no paint transfer, no material he could identify. He found a rag in the back seat and wiped at it. The smear lightened, but did not fully come off. He wiped again. Better, but not gone. He stood in the parking lot under the morning light and looked at the grill for a while, and then put the rag away and drove to the diner across the road for breakfast. After he ate, he drove back to find the shortcut road. He had a general sense of where he'd turned off the main highway. He remembered the turn, remembered checking the GPS just before it, remembered the way the pavement gave out after the first quarter mile. He drove the relevant section of a highway twice, slowing at every turnoff. There were 3. A paved county road heading east toward a small community, a gravel track leading to what looked like a private farm, and a gated service road with a state forestry sign. None of them matched what he remembered. None of them ran through a hollow alongside a creek. None of them had the rock face at the first curve or the culvert crossing at the second. He checked his GPS history when he got back to the motel. The route log showed a straight line along the main highway from his trailhead parking lot to the motel. No detour, no secondary road. The app had no record of the gravel road, the hollow, the curves, or the 20-some minutes he'd spent on them. He checked his odometer against the GPS distance. The GPS said the drive from trailhead to motel was 14 miles. His odometer showed 18.1, 4.1 miles that the GPS did not account for. He sat with that for a while and could not make it fit into anything reasonable. Dead GPS? Sure. Frozen app? Sure. But odometers don't freeze. Odometers measure wheel rotation, and his wheels had rotated 4.1 miles more than the GPS knew about. That was either a mechanical error in a truck with no previous odometer issues, or it was 4.1 miles that had happened somewhere the GPS couldn't see. He ate breakfast at the motel diner the following morning. He had one more day before his drive home, and found himself sitting at the counter next to an older man who'd been reading a county paper, and who had the specific look of someone who'd lived in an area long enough that the newspaper was mostly a confirmation of things he already knew. TW didn't plan to say anything. He'd been sitting with the account for 2 days and hadn't told anyone. But the man asked how the hiking had been, the way people do at diners near trailheads, and TW found himself describing the drive. Not all of it. The road through the hollow, the way the GPS had failed, the way the odometer didn't match. The man listened without interrupting. When TW finished, he picked up his coffee cup and looked at it for a moment. "Which hollow?" he said. TW described the turnoff as best he could. The approximate location on the highway, the direction, the creek. The man set the cup down. "There's no road through that hollow," he said. "Not since the bridge washed out in '09. He didn't say it dramatically. He said it the way Dale would have said something, carefully, accurately, as information. The county never rebuilt it. Too expensive for a road that served maybe 3 properties, and those families all moved out after the flood." He picked up his paper again. "Roads been closed 17 years. TW said, "I drove it last night." The man looked at him. He didn't argue. He didn't suggest TW was mistaken or confused or tired from hiking. He just looked at him with an expression that TW described as recognition, not surprise, and then he looked back at his paper. That was the end of the conversation. TW drives mountain roads in daylight now. He doesn't explain why to people who ask about his travel preferences. He mentioned in his submission that he's looked up the hollow on county road maps 3 times since the incident, in 3 different databases. The road appears on maps from 2008 and earlier. After 2009, the maps show the hollow with no road through it. Just contour lines and a creek and the gap between the ridges that the road used to run through. He didn't go back to look for the road. He said he thought about it. He decided that some questions were better asked from a certain distance, and that he had already been a lot closer to this one than he was comfortable with. The 5th account comes from a retired ranger, and it's the account he gave us with the most conditions, the most things he asked us not to say. What he was willing to share is this. RH spent 22 years as a ranger on the AT corridor in southwestern North Carolina before he retired, and he agreed to share one incident on the condition that we not name the specific trail section, not name the missing hiker, and not speculate in print about what he heard. He was clear about that last part. He said he had spent several years doing his own speculating and it had not been useful, and he didn't want to add more of it to the world. He wanted to describe what happened. Just the facts of it in order, without interpretation. We agreed to his conditions. What follows is as close to his exact account as we could render it. It was late November, a Tuesday, overcast and cold, 41 degrees at the trailhead when RH signed out that morning. He was conducting what he described as a personal courtesy sweep of a section of trail that had been the subject of a 9-day search for a missing hiker. The search had been called off that morning, officially suspended pending new information that everyone involved understood was unlikely to arrive. The hiker had been reported overdue 9 days prior. The search grid had been thorough. No subject, no equipment, no sign of a recent camp. The trail section had been reopened to the public, and RH's official duties for the day were elsewhere. The courtesy sweep was his own time. He didn't explain it further than that, and we didn't ask him to. People who work searches long enough develop their own relationship with the cases that don't close, and RH had been on the corridor for 22 years. He'd worked 4 searches that ended without resolution. This was the 5th. He described his gear the way he always did in the field. Radio on his hip, pack with the standard kit, dented thermos of coffee that he'd owned since his 2nd year on the job. He noted the weather. Overcast, no wind to speak of, the specific flat light of a late November day that makes distances hard to judge and the forest feel closer than it is. He followed the search grid from the southern access point, moving methodically through each designated zone, checking under rock overhangs, scanning the laurel thickets that had slowed the main search team. He found nothing in the first 6 zones, documented it accurately, as was habit. Zone 7 was a steep descent into a laurel-choked ravine, one of the sections that had required rope gear during the main search, technically demanding enough that only 2 members of the team had been able to reach the floor. The ravine floor itself had been searched and cleared on day 4. RH could not reach the floor without rope gear he hadn't brought, and he knew it. He worked the upper rim of the ravine instead, checking the edges, looking for anything the main team might have missed in the approach zones. He was at the rim, maybe 80 feet above the floor, when he heard it. 3 blasts. Sharp, clean, evenly spaced. A standard emergency whistle signal. The kind every hiker on the AT carries and every ranger knows by sound. The kind that is specifically designed to cut through ambient forest noise and carry over long distances. RH had heard emergency whistles many times in his career. He had no uncertainty about what he was hearing. He stopped walking. He stood at the rim and listened. The sound had come from below, from the ravine floor. He keyed his radio immediately. He was calm on the radio, 22 years of practice, and RH was the kind of person who understood that calm on the radio was not optional, that the information was what mattered, and the voice carrying it needed to be steady. He gave his position, described what he'd heard, requested the search team return with rope access. His supervisor acknowledged. Team would be there in 45 minutes. While he waited, RH attempted to descend. He got 80 feet down the ravine wall before the terrain became impassable without equipment. A near vertical section of a wet rock and exposed root, nothing to anchor to. From that position he could see the ravine floor. He studied it for several minutes with the focused attention of someone who had spent 2 decades reading terrain for signs of human presence. The floor was empty. No movement. No color that didn't belong to the rock and leaf litter and the thin line of water running through the lowest point of the ravine. No person, no pack, no equipment. He climbed back to the rim and waited. The team arrived in 43 minutes. 4 people, rope gear, the search team leader who had run the original 9-day operation, and who had, RH noted, the particular expression of a person who has been called back to a case they believed was finished. The team leader didn't say anything about that. He geared up and went down. They spent 3 hours on the ravine floor. RH stayed at the rim, monitoring the radio, watching the descent lines. He could see portions of the floor from his position, not all of it. The ravine bent slightly at the southern end, but a significant section. He watched the team work the grid methodically, the same careful approach they'd used during the main search. At 2 hours and 40 minutes, one of the team members radioed up. They'd found something. RH described what happened next with the same flat precision he used for everything else in the account. The team member had located the missing hiker's water filter. It was sitting on a flat rock near the center of the ravine floor, a rock that RH could see clearly from his position at the rim. The filter was upright, placed carefully, not dropped or discarded. The brand markings were visible from a distance. RH looked at the rock. He had been looking at that rock intermittently for the 3 hours the team had been below. He had looked at it before the team descended. He had looked at it from his lower position on the ravine wall, 80 feet down, before he'd been forced to stop. The rock had been empty. He was certain of that. He said it in the account the same way he said everything else, without drama, without qualification beyond accuracy. The rock had been empty when he was looking at it. The water filter was on the rock when the team found it. The window of time between those two observations was approximately 4 minutes, long enough for him to climb back to the rim from his lower position, long enough for the team to work from the descent point to the center of the floor. Not long enough for a person to place an object on that rock without being visible to RH at the rim or to the team on the floor. The filter was identified from the serial number notation in the missing hiker's file. It matched. It was the hiker's filter, the one listed in the original gear inventory taken from the hiker's registered equipment. It had not appeared in any of the search team's documented finds during the 9-day operation. It had not been on that rock during the search. It had not been on that rock when RH was looking at it. And then it was. His supervisor's notation on the incident report said, "Filter likely dislodged by earlier search activity and moved to visible location by water flow or animal behavior." RH signed the report. He did not add a notation of his own because he could not document his objection in a way that the report format could contain. The filter had been upright, placed upright specifically on a flat surface. Water flow does not place objects upright. Animals do not place equipment carefully on flat rocks. He said one more thing before he ended the account. He mentioned the older ranger, the one who'd spent 30 years on the corridor before RH arrived, who'd told him once that when a search goes past 7 days and you haven't found the person, the mountain has already made its decision. RH had always thought that was grief, the way people in hard jobs develop language for things they can't fix. He said he thought about it differently now. Not that he'd adopted the belief exactly. More that he understood why the older ranger had needed it. He retired 8 months after the incident. He said the two things were not connected. He said it once, clearly, and then he said he'd rather not discuss the timeline further. He closed the account the way he'd opened it, carefully, with an eye on the exact boundary of what he was willing to claim. He said, "I don't know what I heard. I know what it sounded like. I know what I found on that rock and when I found it. I have a report with a blank where the explanation should be, and I've stopped expecting the blank to fill in." The sixth account is the one that's hardest to categorize, because it's not really about the trail itself. It's about what was waiting at the edge of it. Gina grew up in a small hollow community in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, close enough to the AT corridor that the trail was simply a fact of the landscape, the way a river or a ridge is a fact, present, acknowledged, not discussed at length. She is 38 now and lives 2 counties over. and she tells this story as something that happened to a thru hiker named Paul, who passed through her hometown in the summer of 2018 and who she met briefly at the diner where she was working that season. She kept in touch with him afterward, the way you sometimes keep in touch with people who pass through a place during a strange period. And Paul gave her permission to share the account provided she didn't name the town. She doesn't name the town. She describes it only as a hollow community, population around 300, one main road, a post office that doubled as a general store, a diner, a hardware store, a gas station, and a motel with 8 rooms run by an older couple named Bev and Gerald. She says the town sat at the edge of the AT corridor the way some towns do, close enough that thru hikers passed through regularly during season, far enough from the main trail infrastructure that it wasn't in any of the guidebooks. Hikers found it by word of mouth, or by following a Blue Blaze side trail down from the ridge, or sometimes by accident. Paul found it by accident. He'd taken a wrong turn at a junction, an easy mistake on a foggy morning, and followed a side trail down into the hollow instead of continuing north on the main route. By the time he realized the error, he was already at the edge of town, and his feet were in the kind of shape that made the idea of climbing back up to the ridge and continuing feel inadvisable. He'd been on trail for 70 days. He needed a 0 day. He booked the last available room at Bev and Gerald's motel for 2 nights and texted his resupply schedule forward by a day. Gina served him breakfast on his first morning. She described him as quiet in the way that long trail hikers get quiet. Not unfriendly, just economized. Like someone who has been alone with their thoughts long enough that words feel like a currency to spend carefully. He ate 2 full plates of eggs and biscuits, and drank 4 cups of coffee, and read a paperback he'd been carrying since Georgia. She said he seemed fine, normal, the kind of hiker she'd seen come through the hollow dozens of times. He spent the first day doing what 0 days are for: laundry at the coin machines behind the gas station, a resupply run to the post office store, a long shower, an early dinner, an early bedtime. He called his mother from the motel room before the signal thinned. He read the cabin guest book on the desk, not a cabin, a motel, but Bev kept a guest book anyway, a habit she'd started years ago, a way of tracking who had come through. Paul read it the way hikers read trail registers, looking for names he recognized from the register entries he'd seen further south. He read until a few pages before the end, where the entries thinned out and the handwriting changed. Fewer people, different ink, different tone. Then he noticed the gap. A section of pages near the middle of the book, 6 or 8 of them, torn out close to the spine. The edges were still there. You could see where the pages had been removed, not carefully, but completely. He didn't think much of it. Guest books sometimes had pages removed by owners who wanted to edit the record. A bad review, an inappropriate entry, something a previous guest had written that caused a problem. He closed the book and went to sleep. He was asleep before 10. He woke at 20 minutes to midnight, and he was not certain at first what had woken him. The room was dark. The motel was quiet. He lay there and listened and was about to conclude it was nothing, the particular nothing of an unfamiliar building settling, pipes, the old refrigerator unit under the window cycling on. And then he heard it, the back stairwell, a creak, low and deliberate, the sound of weight on an old wooden step. 1 step, then nothing. Then another step, a few seconds later, then another. Paul was on the 2nd floor. The back stairwell ran along the exterior of the building, accessible from a door at the end of the hallway, a secondary exit, the kind old buildings have for fire code reasons, the kind that usually stayed closed. He counted the creaks. 7. The stairwell had a landing partway up and then a second run of stairs to the 2nd floor, and he'd used the main stairs all day without looking at the back exit closely, but 7 creaks felt right for a staircase of that height. Then silence. A full minute of it, maybe more. Then, at the hallway door, not his room door, the door from the stairwell into the second-floor hallway, a soft sound, not a knock. Something dragging slowly along the bottom of the door, the way a piece of weather stripping sounds when a door opens. Except the door didn't open. The sound happened once and stopped. Paul lay in the dark and did not turn on the light. He thought about the motel room door between him and the hallway, which he had locked and chain-latched before bed, which was solid enough and which he felt reasonable about. He thought about the window, which Bev's note had told him not to open. He had opened it earlier because the room was warm. He got up quietly and closed it and latched it and went back to bed. He told Gina about it at breakfast the next morning, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting something odd rather than something frightening. A sound in the stairwell. The thing at the hallway door. He asked if there were other guests. Bev was the one who answered. She came out of the kitchen with the coffee pot and listened to his description without interrupting, and then set the pot down on the counter. "We put a note out for all the hikers," she said. Paul asked what she meant. "The note under the door," she said. "Don't open the window. Don't answer the door after 10. Don't use the back stairwell." Paul remembered the note. He'd read it when he arrived, found it mildly eccentric, and set it on the desk. He said he'd opened the window because the room was warm. He said he'd closed it later. Bev refilled his cup. "Good," she said. He asked why. What was the note about? What was in the stairwell? She looked at him in a way that Gina, watching from the kitchen pass-through, described as neither evasive nor particularly troubled. The look of someone who has explained something many times and has found the simplest version of the explanation. "Some of the trail comes through here at night," Bev said. And then she picked up the coffee pot and went back to the kitchen. Paul sat with that for a while. He asked Gina later what Bev meant. Gina said she didn't entirely know, only that she'd grown up hearing it said that the town had a particular relationship with the trail that she couldn't fully explain to an outsider, and that most of the people who lived there had simply learned to observe certain habits after dark, the way you learn to observe any habit that keeps things running smoothly. Don't open the window. Don't answer the door after 10. Don't use the back stairwell. He spent the day in town. He ate lunch at the diner, which was open. He bought a few things at the hardware store. He walked the main road to its end and back. The town was quiet in a way that felt purposeful by mid-afternoon, not unfriendly, but contained, the way a place feels when its residents are aware of something and have agreed without discussion not to foreground it for visitors. At 4 o'clock, the diner closed early. At 5, the gas station locked up, though a truck remained in the lot. By 6, the main road was empty. Paul went back to the motel. He ate from his resupply. He read. He closed the window before dark, without being asked. He double-checked the chain latch. He positioned himself in the bed with his back against the headboard and his headlamp on the nightstand, and told himself he would stay awake. He lasted until 9:45, when sleep took him the way it takes people who have hiked 70 days, completely, without negotiation. At 9:58 by the clock on the nightstand, he woke up. Somewhere below him, the back stairwell door opened. He counted without deciding to. It was the same reflex as the night before, his mind reaching for something measurable in the dark, something that could be tracked and documented even if it couldn't be explained. 1 creak. 2. The same deliberate spacing as the previous night. The same weight distribution on the old wood. The same pause at what he estimated was the landing. 3. 4. He was sitting up by the time he reached 5, back against the headboard, hands flat on the blanket. The room was dark. He had not turned on the headlamp. Some part of him understood, without being able to articulate why, that the light was a decision he did not want to make yet. 5, 6, then 7, and then the hallway door. Heavier than the stairwell steps. A different sound, the door itself moving on its hinges. Not thrown open, eased. The careful movement of something that understood the difference between the two. Then the hallway, not footsteps. That was the first thing Paul noted in the account he gave Gina later, and Gina noted it in the way she told it to us, not footsteps. A sliding sound on the hallway carpet, even and unhurried, moving from the direction of the stairwell door toward the row of rooms, moving toward his end of the hall. Paul sat with his hands flat on the blanket and did not breathe. The sound stopped outside his door. Not approximately outside, not somewhere in the general vicinity of his room, directly outside, at the point where the sliding sound would have reached his door if it had continued at the same pace from the stairwell entrance. He could feel the proximity of it the way you feel proximity in the dark, through some sense that isn't hearing or sight. Something close. Something that had stopped because it had reached where it was going. 90 seconds. He counted those too. 90 seconds of complete silence in the hallway, and the room, and the building, and as far as he could tell, the street outside the window and the hollow beyond it. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful because it requires too much effort from too many things at once. Then, at the very bottom of his door, the gap between the door and the carpet, the half-inch of space that let the light from the hallway nightlight seep in as a thin line, something moved. The same soft brushing sound he'd heard the night before at the stairwell door. Not a knock, not scratching. A slow, lateral movement along the bottom of the door, left to right, then back, then a third time. Even. Patient. The way you'd move a hand if you were feeling for the edge of something in the dark. Paul did not answer it. He did not speak. He did not move toward the door or away from it. He pressed his back harder against the headboard, and he held the position with both hands flat on the blanket, and he waited. The brushing stopped after the third pass. He did not hear anything leave. That was what he told Gina, and what Gina passed along carefully because she thought it was the most important detail. He heard it arrive, the stairwell, the hallway door, the sliding approach, the stop outside his room. He never heard it go. At some point, the hallway was simply quiet in a different way than it had been quiet during those 90 seconds. A quiet that felt unoccupied rather than held, and he understood that whatever had been outside his door was no longer there. He did not move for 40 minutes. He tracked the time on the nightstand clock, watching the numbers change in the dark from across the room, and he did not leave the bed until the clock read 20 past 4. Then he turned on the headlamp, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited for dawn. At 7, he opened the door. The hallway was empty. The nightlight at the far end still on, the carpet undisturbed, the row of doors all closed. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then walked to the end of the hall and looked at the stairwell door. It was standing open, the same way it had been standing open the morning before, despite the fact that he had not heard anything use it to leave, and had not heard the door open again after whatever was in the hallway had gone quiet. It stood open at roughly the same angle as the previous morning, as if it were a door that ended its nights open, regardless of how it began them. Paul walked to the stairwell and looked down. The stairwell was dim, the light from the open door at the top the only source. He could see the landing and the lower run of stairs and the concrete floor of the bottom landing. The walls were bare, painted cinder block. The kind of back stairwell that exists in old buildings and is never quite finished, never quite cared for, On the bottom landing, in the center of the concrete floor, there was a mark. He went down for a better look. The concrete was old and stained in various ways. Water damage, age, the general accumulation of a stairwell that had not been cleaned in some time. But this mark was distinct from the staining. A muddy impression. Partial, not complete. The shape of a forward section of a foot, toes, and ball, without a heel. The toes were longer than a human foot's toes in the same proportion. More widely spaced, pressed into what must have been a thin layer of moisture on the concrete, dried now to a faint brownish outline. He photographed it and went to breakfast. Bev was already in the kitchen. Gina was setting the counter. Paul sat down and ordered coffee and eggs, and then described the previous night to Bev when she came out with the pot. All of it. The stairwell, the hallway, the sound at the door. The 3 passes of the brushing sound. The door standing open in the morning. The impression on the landing. Bev listened with the same expression she'd had the morning before, not alarmed, not dismissive. Attentive, in the way of someone confirming information they already broadly possessed. When he finished, she said, "You didn't open the door." He said he hadn't. "Good," she said. It was the same word she'd used the morning before, in the same tone, not relief exactly. More like the acknowledgement of a correct procedure followed. He asked her what it was, what used the stairwell, what had been in the hallway outside his door. She was quiet for a moment, and Paul said it was the only time in either of their conversations that she seemed to be actually considering how to answer, rather than simply selecting the appropriate level of detail from information she already had. "We don't know," she said. "We stopped asking about 15 years ago." He asked if it was dangerous, if anyone had been hurt. She shook her head. "Not if you follow the note," she said. And then, because Paul pressed her once more, she added, "It doesn't come in. It just wants to know if someone's home." She refilled his coffee, and that was the end of it. Paul left at 9 that morning. He hiked back up the Blue Blaze Trail to the main route and continued north. He finished his through hike in late September and called Gina from the northern terminus because she was one of the people he'd told about the hollow, and he wanted her to know he'd made it. He told her he thought about the town more than any other night on the trail. Not with fear exactly, more with the particular weight of something that had happened to him that he didn't have a frame for, that sat outside the categories he normally used to organize experience. Gina asked her grandmother about it once, after Paul's account. Her grandmother had grown up in that hollow and was in her 80s, and had the specific authority of someone who had observed a landscape for a very long time without needing to dramatize it. Her grandmother said, "It's not from the trail just gives it a way to walk." Gina said she'd turned that over many times since, and still didn't know exactly what it meant. She said her grandmother had not seemed troubled by the question or the answer. She said it in the same tone Bev used, the tone of someone describing a fact about the local geography. The creek floods in March, the road ices before the highway. The trail gives it a way to walk. What it was, where it came from, why it observed the boundaries it observed. These things the town had stopped asking about 15 years ago, and Gina had the impression they'd stopped asking not because the answers were too frightening, but because the answers, whatever they were, had not turned out to change anything about how you needed to live there. You followed the note. You didn't open the door. You didn't use the back stairwell after 10. And it didn't come in. It just wanted to know if someone was home. The 7th account is the one that took the most convincing to tell. It came from a woman who agreed to share it only if we described it as a cabin rental story, and didn't say which state. We agreed. The woman's name, for the purposes of this account, is S. She's in her early 40s, works in a field that requires precision and careful observation, and is the kind of person who, when she describes an experience, distinguishes carefully between what she saw, what she heard, what she concluded, and what she still cannot account for. She made that distinction explicit at the start of our conversation. She said, "I'm going to tell you what happened. I'm not going to tell you what it means. I don't know what it means." She'd been through a difficult year. She didn't specify the nature of it, and we didn't ask. She said only that she needed several days of complete quiet and that she'd found a cabin rental listing on a short-term platform that seemed to offer exactly that. Secluded, no neighbors within 2 miles, no reliable cell signal, strong for writing. The listing had good reviews. The photographs showed a well-maintained 1-story cabin with a covered porch, a wood stove, a kitchen with a window above the sink, and a main room with enough natural light to work in during the day. She booked 6 nights. She drove up on a Wednesday afternoon. The last 8 miles were on a gravel road that the listing had mentioned, 1 lane with occasional pullouts for passing, the kind of road that makes you commit to the destination because turning around is more trouble than continuing. She found the cabin without difficulty. The key was under a flat rock beside the porch steps, tagged with a plastic tag from a hardware store with the cabin number written on it in marker. The owner, a man named Dave who lived 40 minutes away in town, had texted her instructions that morning and asked her to let him know when she arrived. She texted him from the porch. He responded within a few minutes. "Great. Call if anything comes up. Service gets thin at night." The cabin was clean and exactly as advertised. She unloaded her car in 2 trips, stacked her groceries on the kitchen counter, and spent a few minutes checking the wood stove, clean firebox, good draw when she opened the damper, a stack of split wood beside the porch that would last several days. The propane lantern on the porch table worked. The porch light, a single bulb and a fixture beside the door, buzzed faintly when she switched it on and threw a yellow circle that reached to the edge of the porch boards and stopped there. The tree line beyond it completely dark. She ate dinner, heated on the small electric range. She left the porch light on and sat at the main room table and wrote for 2 hours, which was more than she'd managed in several weeks, and the quality of the quiet, deep, layered, the sound of the woods at night rather than the absence of sound, felt like exactly what she'd come for. Before bed, she read the guest book. Bev's guest book habit was apparently not unique to West Virginia. Dave kept one too, a cloth-covered journal on the desk in the main room, and S read it the way she read everything, carefully and in full. Most entries were positive, specific, the kind of notes people leave when a place has done something for them. She enjoyed reading them. She was halfway through when she noticed the spine. 6 pages, approximately, had been removed from the middle of the book. Not torn, cut or carefully pulled close to the binding, but the edges were still visible if you looked for them. The book continued past the gap without any obvious indication of what had been on the missing pages. She noted it the way she noted most things, as a fact, filed, not yet interpreted. The last entry before the gap said, in handwriting that was slightly cramped, as if the writer was being economical with space, "Great cabin. Slept well. Don't try the back room." That was the complete entry. No date issues, no other comment. Just that. S closed the guest book and went to bed. She told herself the backroom note was the kind of thing bored guests wrote to unsettle the next person. The cabin equivalent of a jump scare, a small performance of mystery for an imagined future reader. She had seen similar things in trail registers. People liked to leave small disturbances behind them. She slept well the first night. The woods were quiet in the deep way she'd hoped for, and she woke rested for the first time in months. On the second night, she heard the porch. Old cabins make noise. She knew that and had factored it into her expectations. The porch board shifted when the temperature dropped. The wood stove ticked as it cooled after she banked it for the night. and somewhere behind the kitchen wall the pipes made a low knock every few minutes that she'd tracked and categorized on the first night. These were the sounds of the building. She knew their rhythm by the second evening, the way you learn the rhythm of any space you inhabit. What she heard at some point after midnight was not in that rhythm. 2 boards, close together, then one closer to the door. A sequence. Not the random tick of cooling wood, but a progression across the porch. Weight bearing? The specific compression of old boards under something that was moving. She lay in the dark and listened to it and measured it against everything she knew about the sounds of the building, and it did not fit. She got up and turned on the porch light from the interior switch without opening the door. The light came on and threw its yellow circle across the porch boards. Nothing there. The wood stack, the propane lantern, the 2 porch chairs, the small table, all exactly as she'd left them. She stood at the window beside the door and looked out for a full minute. Nothing moved. She went back to bed and told herself, wildlife, a raccoon, a possum, something that had come onto the porch and left when the light came on. Completely consistent with what she'd heard. She had no reason to think otherwise. In the morning, she walked around the exterior of the cabin before starting her coffee. It was a habit from childhood, a thing her father had done every morning at their family's camp. A quick circuit, no particular agenda, just a look at the perimeter. The porch was undisturbed. The wood stack was intact. The gravel around the cabin held no clear impressions after the dry week. Then she reached the back of the cabin, the side that faced uphill into the woods, and she saw the door. It was at the end of a short hallway she'd assumed led to a utility space. Water heater maybe, or additional storage. She hadn't tried the handle because the hallway was dim and she'd had no reason to. Now, looking at it from the exterior, she could see that what she'd thought was a utility door was a full room door. A window that she'd noticed from outside on her arrival. Small, set high in the back wall of the cabin, corresponded to this room. She went back inside and looked at the door directly. It was nailed shut. 3 large nails driven through the frame at angles. Old paint over the nail heads. The kind of permanent closure that had been there long enough to seem architectural. No interior handle. The door was simply sealed. She texted Dave. There's a room at the back of the cabin with the door nailed shut. Just want to make sure that's intentional. His response came after a delay long enough that her phone had dimmed twice. Storage room. Full of old furniture. No access needed. Ignore it. She read the guest book entry again. Don't try the back room. She read it once more. Then she wedged a chair under the door handle. Even though there was no handle, even though the door was nailed through the frame, she wedged the chair because the action of doing it made her feel marginally better. And she went back to the main room and opened her laptop and wrote for 4 hours. Good work, focused. The cabin doing what it was supposed to do. That night she left the porch light on. She did not hear the boards again. On the 3rd night, she was washing her cup at the kitchen sink before bed. The window above the sink faced the back of the cabin, the high side where the ground rose steeply into the woods, and the cabin's back wall sat close to the slope. It was a casement window, latched. She had not opened it. The glass was old, slightly wavy in the way of old glass, and it reflected the kitchen light back at her when she looked at it directly. She was rinsing the cup when she looked up. 2 handprints on the outside of the glass. Pressed flat, palms and fingers extended, at a height on the window that would require, she worked this out standing at the sink, looking at the prints, the cup still in her hand, something standing on the slope outside, or on a surface at least 6 feet above the ground grade on that side of the cabin. There was no porch on that side, no railing, no structure. The slope dropped away from the cabin foundation. To reach that window from the outside, something would have to be pressed against the cabin wall and reaching up, or standing on a surface that did not exist. She stood at the sink and looked at the prints and did not move for a long time. The prints were clear in the reflected light. 4 fingers and a thumb on each hand. Spread flat, deliberate, the way you press your hands against glass when you're trying to see through it. She set the cup down on the counter very carefully, the way you set things down when you are trying not to make noise, and she reached over and turned off the kitchen light. She stood in the dark kitchen for a moment after the light went out. The window above the sink now just a rectangle of lesser dark. The handprints no longer visible without the reflected light behind them. She could feel her own heartbeat in a way she normally couldn't. She noted that factually, the way she noted most things, and she did not move toward the window. She moved away from it. She went to the main room and turned off the lamp there too, and then she stood in the complete dark of the cabin and thought through what she knew. The handprints were on the outside of the glass. Something had put them there. The window was on the high side of the cabin where the ground dropped away sharply, where there was nothing to stand on. She had a car in the gravel drive. She had a phone with intermittent service. She had a wood stove that was banked for the night and a porch light she could turn on. She turned on the porch light. Not because it helped with the back of the cabin. It didn't. The porch was on the front. But because the light did something for her that she couldn't entirely rationalize. It made the front of the cabin known. It drew a line. She sat in the main room chair, not the one she'd wedged under the back room door, and she put her car keys on the armrest beside her hand, and she sat there in the light coming from the porch through the front window, and she waited. She heard nothing from the porch, no boards, no movement, no sound from the gravel. The woods beyond the porch light were dark and quiet. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. The pipes made their periodic knock behind the kitchen wall. Then, at approximately 4 in the morning, she checked her phone when she heard it. Something moved against the exterior of the cabin. Not on the porch. On the back side, the high side, the side with the window and the slope. A low sound, close to the ground level of the cabin's foundation, deliberate and slow. Moving laterally along the back wall. Moving in the direction of the back room. She sat in the chair with her car keys in her hand, and she did not go to the kitchen. She did not turn on any more lights. She listened to the sound travel along the back wall until it reached the corner of the back room and then stopped. Then nothing. She sat until first light, which came gray and gradual through the front windows, and when the shapes of the trees were visible and the gravel drive was a pale line through the dimness, she stood up and went to the kitchen. The handprints were still on the window. She could see them clearly in the morning light, clearer than the night before. 2 full handprints, the kind of contact impression that required deliberate pressure, not a brush or a graze. She photographed them with her phone. Then she went outside and walked around the back of the cabin. The slope was steep on that side, the ground falling away from the cabin foundation within a foot of the wall. There was nothing to stand on. No ladder, no equipment, no structure of any kind. The grade at the base of the wall, directly below the window, was soft leaf litter over soil, and she crouched and looked at it in the morning light. There was a compression in the leaf litter. Not a clear footprint. The leaves were too loose and layered for that, but a depression roughly where feet would be if something had been pressed against the cabin wall reaching upward. The width of it was consistent with 2 feet side by side, or close together. She could not determine more than that. She photographed it. Then she stood up and looked at the window from the outside and worked out the height again with her own arm raised above her head. To press flat hands against that glass from this position, standing on this slope, she would have to be considerably taller than she was. Or she would have to be standing on something that had since been removed. Or the geometry would have to work differently than she was calculating it. None of those options were more comfortable than the others. She went back inside and checked the back room door. The chair was still wedged under it, handle end under the door with the legs angled to the floor, exactly as she'd placed it. She crouched and looked at the gap between the door bottom and the floor. Dark grit had been pushed outward through the gap. A thin line of it, fine and dark. The kind of grit that accumulates on old wooden floors, pushed through from the inside of the room to the hallway side. Not a large amount. Enough to see clearly in the morning light. Enough to have come from somewhere. The door was nailed shut. The chair was in place. She had not been in the room. She had not opened the door. She stood up and looked at the chair and the door and the thin line of dark grit on the hallway floor, and she made a decision that she described, in her account, as the clearest decision she made during the entire 6 nights. She packed her car. Not in a panic, she went through the cabin methodically, collecting her things from each room, checking the stove and the propane and the lights, leaving the cabin in the condition she'd found it. She was efficient and she was thorough and her hands were steady. She left the chair wedged under the back room door when she left. She called Dave from the gravel drive with 2 bars of signal. He answered on the second ring, which surprised her. It was early, barely past 7. She described the handprints. She described the sound along the back wall. She described the grit pushed out from under the sealed door. Dave was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not the quiet of someone surprised. "Did anything get in?" he said. She said no. He said, "I'm sorry. I should have put something in the listing." She asked what he should have put in the listing. He said that you should keep the lights off on the backside after midnight. And then, when she didn't respond immediately, he said, "It's a bear. The elevation brings them in close to the cabin in the fall. They press up against the walls where it's warm. I should have warned you." She said, "The handprints have fingers." Dave did not answer that directly. He said he was sorry again. He said if she wanted a refund for the remaining nights, he understood completely, and she should send him a message through the platform. He said the cabin was safe. He said that in the way people say a thing when they want it to be the last word on a subject. She did not argue with him. She thanked him and ended the call and sat in the gravel drive for a moment looking at the cabin. It looked exactly as it had when she arrived. Clean porch, wood stack, the window above the kitchen sink reflecting the morning sky. Ordinary in every visible way. Almost. She drove the 8 miles of gravel to the county road and did not look in the rearview mirror. The rational explanation was bears. Black bears were documented in the region, were known to approach cabins for warmth in fall, were capable of reaching considerable heights when pressed against a structure. The sound along the back wall was consistent with a large animal moving close to the foundation. The compression in the leaf litter was consistent with an animal's feet. These things were true, and S knew they were true. The handprints in her photograph showed 4 fingers and a thumb on each hand, spread flat, the proportions falling within human range. Bears have 5 digits. Their prints, when pressed flat against a surface, do not resolve into the shape of spread human fingers. This was also true, and S knew it too. She sent the photograph to 2 people she trusted. Both of them looked at it for a long time before saying anything. One of them said it was probably a person, some local who knew the cabin and its access points, and that she should report it to Dave formally and to local law enforcement. The other one said nothing for a while and then said, "I don't know what that is." She did not rent remote cabins alone after that. When she traveled to places that required staying somewhere unfamiliar, she checked every room before she put her bag down, looked at every window, noted every door that was unusual. She read every guest book entry if there was one. She paid particular attention to entries near gaps in the pages. Several months after the trip, she looked up the cabin listing out of a habit she couldn't quite name. The listing had been updated. The photographs were the same. The description was largely the same. One line had been added to the amenities section, quietly, between the wood stove listing and the note about the gravel road. Locked storage room, not included in rental. And at the bottom of the listing in the house rules section, a new rule had been added after the standard ones about noise and smoking and pets. It read, "Guests are asked to keep rear-facing windows covered after dark." S said she still thought about the grit pushed under the door. Whatever was in that room wasn't trying to get out. It was already out. It just wanted her to know. The last account is the one we almost didn't include. Not because we couldn't verify the basic facts, the trail closure, the search, the dates, but because the woman who sent it asked us to end with a question, not an answer. We're going to honor that. Her name for this account is Claire. She's 29 years old, has completed 4 prior AT section hikes, carries the right gear, knows the trail etiquette, and is the kind of a hiker who checks conditions before she goes. Closure notices, weather forecasts, recent register entries on the trail forums. She is not careless. She is not the kind of person who ends up in a situation through inattention. She chose the section because the closure had just lifted. A portion of the AT, the specific location withheld at Claire's request, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic region of the trail, had been closed for 2 weeks following the disappearance of a solo hiker. Standard procedure when a search is active on a section. The trail closes, the search team works, hikers are routed around. The search had ended without resolution 11 days in. The trail had been reopened 2 days before Claire arrived. She knew about the missing hiker. She'd read a brief account online, the basic facts, the search timeline, the reopening notice. She noted it the way she noted any recent trail history on a section she was planning to hike, as context, as relevant information. She was not troubled by it in any way that changed her plans. Missing hikers were a documented reality of the AT. They happened every season. The trail had been cleared and reopened by the managing agency, and she was a competent solo hiker. She went. She reached the trailhead parking lot at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. The lot had space for maybe a dozen cars. 2 others were already there when she arrived, both empty, day hikers who'd started before her, or maybe cars from the previous day's hikers who'd shuttled out. She didn't know and didn't need to know. She checked her pack, laced her boots, and went to the trail register box at the trailhead. She opened the register and signed in. Name, date, intended destination, expected return. She noted the last entry before hers was 4 days old. The trail had been open for 2 days, but apparently few people had come through yet. The section's reputation for recent search activity tended to reduce traffic for a week or 2 after reopening, in her experience. She preferred it that way. She preferred fewer people on the trail. She started at 7:40. Clear sky, cool morning. The trail still holding moisture from rain earlier in the week. Good conditions. She made strong time on the first section, the grade gentle and the path well maintained. At mile 3, the cell signal dropped from 1 bar to nothing and did not return. At the junction around mile 4, she paused. She had not seen the junction marked on her map as significant, but there was a sign, hand-painted on a weathered board, nailed to a tulip poplar at the trail's edge. She read it as she passed. Stay on trail. Reasonable enough instruction at any junction, she thought, noting the unmarked side path that climbed steeply away to the left into dense forest. Her map showed nothing there. She continued on the main trail. By mile 6, she had seen no other hikers. The trail was quiet in the way that trails are quiet early in the morning, before the day hikers arrive, before the air warms enough to bring out the insects. She ate a handful of almonds at a creek crossing, refilled her water filter, and kept moving. The terrain was beautiful, and she was aware of it being beautiful, and she was also aware, in the back of her mind, of the specific quality of the quiet. Not peaceful quiet. A quiet that had texture to it. An absence of birdsong that she had not consciously registered until she stopped at the creek, and the silence around her had nothing in it. She registered it, filed it under adjustment period. Birds often went quiet in sections where trail traffic had been unusual. Heavy search activity disrupted the local wildlife patterns and kept moving. She reached the shelter at 4:15 in the afternoon. It was a standard 3-sided AT shelter, well-maintained, with a privy back in the trees and a bear box on a post and a water source 30 yards down the slope. Empty when she arrived. She dropped her pack on the shelter floor and went to the register box on the front post. She opened the register. Standard format: name, date, destination, notes. She read from the back the most recent entries. 2 entries since the reopening, both from the day before, both from what appeared to be a group of 3 hikers moving south. Before them, a gap of 2 weeks corresponding to the closure. Before the closure, the entries ran normally, several per day, the ordinary record of traffic on an active section of trail. She was about to close the register when she turned back one more page. There was an entry dated during the closure period. Not before it, not after it, during it, when the trail had been signed and gated and officially inaccessible. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the letters well-formed, the kind of handwriting that takes its time. The entry had a date in the correct format and a time, mid-afternoon, and in the name field, it had her name, Claire. Her full first name, spelled correctly. Under destination, it said, northbound. Under notes, a single word, arrived. She stood at the shelter register and read the entry 3 times. She was thorough by habit, and she wanted to be certain she was reading it correctly, that the name was not a near match, that the date was not from before the closure in a way she'd miscounted. She was reading it correctly. The date was during the closure. The name was hers. She had told one person her plans for this hike, her friend Danny, who had her rough itinerary in case of emergency. She had not posted the hike publicly. She had not listed her name on any advance register. She had not contacted the trail management agency. Her name was not associated with this section of trail in any record she had created. She photographed the entry with her phone. The photograph showed the register clearly, the date, the time, the name field, the single word under notes. She looked at the photograph for a moment, and then she put her phone in her hip pocket and she set up camp in the shelter, because the shelter was where she was, and the alternative was hiking out in diminishing light on a trail she had not yet fully walked, and Claire was practical. She cooked dinner on her small stove, the ordinary smell of it filling the shelter and drifting out into the trees. She set up her sleeping bag. She organized her pack. She did the routine of a competent hiker making camp. And she did it carefully and thoroughly because routine was useful, and because it gave her hands something to do while her mind sat with the register entry and turned it over. She tried to text Danny at 7:15. 1 bar, intermittent, sent hung on the screen and then failed. She tried again. Failed. She put the phone away. The shelter had a good view down the approach trail. She could see 40 or 50 yards in the fading light before the path bent and disappeared into the trees. She sat on the shelter's front edge and watched the light go. Nothing moved on the trail. No other hikers appeared. The woods settled into dark in the particular way of a section of trail with no other humans in it. Completely, without gradation, one quality of light and then another. She moved into her sleeping bag at 8:30 and lay on her back looking at the shelter roof and listening. The woods were quiet. The specific quality of quiet she'd noticed since the creek at mile 6, the absence beneath the absence, the silence that required too much cooperation from too many things. She lay in it and breathed and did not quite sleep. At 9:47 by her watch, from somewhere behind her, from the direction of the closed section of trail she had passed the junction of earlier that day, a sound reached the shelter. 3 blasts, sharp, clean, evenly spaced, an emergency whistle. She lay still and listened to the silence after it. Then she tried Danny again, sent, hung, failed. She set the phone face down on the shelter floor, and she lay in the dark with the sleeping bag pulled to her chin and she waited. 12 minutes later, the whistle came again. 3 blasts, same cadence, same direction. From behind her, from the closed section, from somewhere a person should not have been able to reach by then, even if they'd started at the junction when she first heard the sound. She sent one more text to Danny. Shelter for the night. Something strange. Will explain tomorrow. Sent. Hung. Failed. She turned off her headlamp. In the complete dark of the shelter, with the trees close and the trail empty in both directions as far as she could tell, and the whistle now silent again, and no explanation for the register entry, and no signal and no other people within 17 miles of trail in any direction she was aware of, Claire lay still and listened to the woods outside and waited to find out what would happen next. The woods gave her nothing for a long time. Just the dark and the quiet and the weight of the register entry sitting at the edge of her thinking. And then, faint and clear and coming from the direction of the trail below the shelter, the sound of footsteps. She did not move. The footsteps were on packed trail dirt, booted, coming from the south, from the direction she'd hiked in, from the open section of trail. Not from the closed section where the whistle had come from. She registered that distinction immediately and held it the way you hold a fact that might matter. South. Open trail. A hiker, possibly, coming in late. Someone she hadn't passed during the day who had started after her and moved fast. She told herself that. She let herself believe it for the 30 seconds it took the footsteps to reach the shelter clearing. They stopped. She lay in her sleeping bag with her headlamp in her hand, and she did not turn it on. The shelter was open on the front, 3 walls, a roof, no door, and she was inside it, and whatever had walked up the trail was now in the clearing in front of it, in the dark, not moving. She listened for the sounds that would come next. A pack being set down. A headlamp clicking on. A voice, "Hey, is someone in there?" The ordinary greeting of a late-arriving hiker who has just found the shelter occupied. The sounds of another person doing the things people do when they arrive somewhere after dark and need to orient themselves. None of those sounds came. What came instead was quiet. The specific quiet of something in the clearing that was not moving and not speaking and not using a light, standing in the dark in front of an open shelter where it knew someone was sleeping. 40 seconds. A minute. She counted. She tightened her grip on the headlamp without turning it on. Her other hand found her phone on the shelter floor beside her. She pressed the button to wake the screen. 1 bar, there for a second, then gone. She typed a text to Danny anyway, hiker in clearing, not saying anything, staying quiet, and hit send and watched it hang. The clearing was still. 2 minutes now, maybe a little more. Then the footsteps resumed. Not toward the shelter, toward the register box on the front post, off to the left of the shelter opening, 6 or 8 feet from where Claire lay. She heard the footsteps cross the clearing to the post. Then a sound she knew. The metal latch of the register box lifted, the cover opening, the specific soft resistance of a register page being turned. Then a sound she could not immediately identify, brief. A pen, maybe, or something functioning like one. The particular scratch of something moving deliberately across paper. She did not move, did not turn on the headlamp, did not speak. The register box closed. The latch clicked back into place. The footsteps crossed the clearing again, away from the post, away from the shelter, back toward the trail, back toward the south. Moving at the same even pace they'd arrived at, unhurried, as if the purpose had been accomplished and there was no reason to linger. She listened to them recede down the trail and fade into the ordinary sound of the woods, and then the woods were quiet again in a way that felt different from the previous quiet. Lighter, less occupied. She lay on her back with the headlamp in her hand for 2 minutes after the footsteps were gone. Then her name. Not shouted, not called with urgency. Said at conversational volume from the clearing in front of the shelter, as if someone standing in the dark had simply noticed she was there and was saying hello. A woman's voice. A specific woman's voice, the particular register and cadence of it, the way it handled the 2 syllables of Claire's name, the breath behind the sound. Danny's voice. She recognized it completely and immediately in the way you recognize the voice of someone you've known for years. The way a voice carries a specific identity that goes beyond its surface characteristics. The timing of it. The way Danny's voice always had a slight upward inflection at the end of a name, as if a name were a small question. That was there. All of it was there. She pressed her hand flat over her mouth. She did not answer. Danny was at home, 6 hours away. Danny did not know the name of this shelter or this section of trail, or where on the AT Claire was sleeping tonight. Danny had Claire's rough itinerary in a text message on her phone. Danny was not in this clearing. The voice said her name once. Then it waited. She held her hand over her mouth and she did not breathe. And she did not answer, and she did not turn on the headlamp. She lay completely still in the sleeping bag and she counted, and she waited, and she let the silence stretch out past the point where a person waiting for an answer would wait. The voice did not speak again. She heard nothing move in the clearing. No footsteps departing, no brush of clothing, no gravel shifting, no branch disturbed. She heard the voice say her name, and then she heard nothing. At some point, the clearing was empty again in the way she could feel rather than verify, the quality of the air outside the shelter changing in a way that had no precise description. She lay still for a long time after that. The woods came back slowly. An insect, distant. The sound of the trees and a light wind she hadn't noticed before. The ordinary nighttime respiration of a forest, returning in pieces, as if the section of trail had been holding its breath and was now releasing it. She did not sleep. She did not try. She lay on her back with the headlamp in her hand, and her phone face up beside her, and she watched the shelter roof and she thought about the register entry with her name on it, and the whistle from the closed section and the footsteps that had gone to the register box and the sound she'd heard there that might have been a pen, and Danny's voice saying her name from a dark clearing on a section of trail Danny did not know the name of. She thought about the warning on the hand-painted sign at the junction. Stay on trail. She thought about the fact that she had stayed on the trail. She thought about the fact that whatever had walked into the clearing tonight had also stayed on the trail. She thought about not answering. She was fairly certain, in the way you are certain about things that cannot be verified, that not answering had been the right choice. At 4:17 in the morning, the sky through the open shelter front began its first gray shift, the absolute dark becoming something slightly less than absolute, the shapes of the trees at the clearing edge resolving out of nothing. Claire sat up. She had not moved in hours, and her body reported this with the specific stiffness of a person who has held perfectly still for a very long time. She put on her boots inside the sleeping bag's warmth, lacing them carefully. She packed her sleeping bag and her pad and her cook kit and her food bag in the order she always packed them. The practiced sequence of it, steadying in the way that familiar things are steadying. She put on her pack. She picked up her headlamp. She had not turned it on all night. She stood at the shelter's open front and looked at the clearing in the first gray light. Empty. The trail visible in both directions for as far as the light allowed. The register box on its post, closed and latched, exactly as it always was. She crossed the clearing to the register box. She opened it. The new entry was below hers. She had to look at it twice the way she'd looked at the first entry. Carefully, making sure she was reading it correctly, that the handwriting was what she thought it was, and the date was what she thought it was, and the words said what she thought they said. The handwriting was the same as the first entry, the same neat, deliberate hand, the letters well formed, taking their time. The date was today's date. The time listed was 2:17 a.m., under notes, 2 words, still here. She closed the register box. She latched it. She stood in the gray clearing for a moment with her pack on and her headlamp in her hand, and she made a decision that was not really a decision so much as a physical fact. Her feet had already turned toward the south trail before she'd consciously formed the thought. She was leaving. She was leaving now, in the gray pre-dawn, on the open section, the way she'd come in. She walked, she did not run. Running on a trail in low light with a loaded pack is how ankles break, and Claire was practical even now, especially now. She walked at the fastest pace that was safe on the terrain, faster than her hiking pace, faster than she'd moved the day before, but controlled, focused. She counted her breaths to keep them even. She watched the trail surface in the thin gray light. She did not look behind her. At mile 3 from the shelter moving back south, she passed the junction with the unmarked side path and the hand-painted sign. In the early morning light, the sign was clearly legible. She read it as she passed without slowing. Stay on trail. The same words she'd read yesterday. She did not stop to examine it. She kept moving. Half a mile past the junction, on a section of trail she had not paid close attention to on the way in. A flat stretch through second-growth forest, the trees young and close, the trail corridor narrow. She noticed a register box she had not seen before. Smaller than the standard shelter boxes, older, partially concealed, where a white birch had grown up close to the post and curved slightly over it. She almost walked past it. She stopped. She stood on the trail and looked at the box for a moment. It was not on her map. It was not the kind of box she'd expect on this section of trail. It had the look of something that had been there for a long time. The wood of the post silvered with age, the metal of the box mottled with rust at the seams. She opened it. Inside was a single logbook, water damaged at the corners, the cover warped and stained. She opened it carefully. The pages were legible but brittle. The ink in the earlier entries faded. She turned to the last written page. The final entry was dated from the week before the trail had been closed for the search. One hiker, northbound, signing in alone. She read the name. She did not recognize it, but she remembered the missing hiker from the account she'd read before her trip, and the dates aligned. This was him. This was his handwriting. different from the neat, deliberate hand in the shelter register, looser, the writing of someone moving through rather than sitting still. Under notes he had written, 2 days out, moving well, trail quiet. Someone's been following behind me since the gap. Probably another hiker. We'll check at the shelter. There was no next entry from him. The page after his was blank. She stood on the trail with the old logbook open in her hands, and she read his note twice. Then she photographed the page, carefully, making sure the date and the handwriting and the words were all clear in the frame. Then she closed the logbook, placed it back in the box, and closed the latch. She walked the remaining miles to the trailhead without stopping. 7 miles, mostly downhill, in strengthening morning light. She counted her steps for the last 2 miles without deciding to, the same way she'd counted the seconds the night before, her mind reaching for something measurable, something that could be tracked. She reached the trailhead at 9:12. Her car was where she'd left it. The lot had one additional vehicle now, a green pickup she didn't recognize. A ranger was at the trailhead kiosk, logging entries in a field notebook. He looked up when she came down the trail, the way rangers look at solo hikers coming off a section early in the morning with a particular expression on their face. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." She showed him the photograph on her phone. The shelter register entry, the neat handwriting, the date, the time, the 2 words under notes. He took the phone from her and looked at it. He looked at it for longer than she expected. His expression did not change in any way she could read clearly, but something in it settled, the way a face settles when it is deciding something. He said, "Which shelter?" She told him. He handed her phone back and picked up his radio. He turned slightly away from her and made a call that she could not fully hear. She caught the shelter name, a code she didn't know, a question about the previous night's register. He waited for a response. When it came, he listened without speaking and then said, "Thank you," and clipped the radio back to his chest. He asked her several questions. When she'd arrived at the shelter, whether she'd seen any other hikers on the section, what she'd heard during the night. She answered all of them accurately and completely. He wrote in his field notebook. He asked for her name and phone number, and she gave them. He said someone might follow up, and she said that was fine. She asked him what the entry meant. Who had written it during the closure, he said. "We'll look into it." He said it the way people say things when the answer to the question is not one they're going to provide at this location, to this person, at this time. She recognized that and didn't press. She drove to the nearest town and ate breakfast at a diner and sat in the booth for an hour after she'd finished eating, because the diner was full of people and noise and ordinary morning life, and she was not ready to be alone in her car yet. She called Danny from the diner. Danny answered immediately, said she'd gotten a series of failed text notifications that had come through as alerts without content, had been mildly worried since 6 in the morning. Claire told her she was fine. She said there was something strange she'd explain later. Danny asked if she wanted company for the drive home. Claire said yes. 6 weeks after the hike, she sent a follow-up inquiry to the trail management agency about the shelter register entry. She received a response 11 days after that. A brief email from an administrative contact. It described the entry as having been made by a registered hiker who had passed through in the early morning hours and used an incorrect date format. It noted that the section had been fully cleared prior to reopening and that all visitor activity had been documented appropriately. It thanked her for her concern. She read the email 3 times. She thought about the timestamp on her own photograph. 6:47 a.m., the time she had photographed the entry in the shelter register. She thought about the date written in the entry, which was not an incorrect format but a correctly formatted date corresponding to 2:17 a.m. that morning, when she had been lying awake in the shelter listening to the woods. She thought about the agency's explanation, which accounted for the entry's existence but not its date, not its time, not its content. She thought about the old logbook in the rusted box and the missing hiker's final note. Someone's been following behind me since the gap, and about the fact that he had intended to check at the shelter and had not written another entry after that intention. She thought about her name in a register on a trail she had not yet reached, written before the trail was open, by a hand she did not recognize. She still hikes the AT. She does not do solo overnights anymore. When she plans a section, she reads the full register history for at least 2 weeks before her start date, scrolling through the forum posts and the app entries and anything else available. She signs in at every register with her trail name, a name she chose after this trip, a name that is not her name. When other hikers at shelters ask what her trail name means, she says it's just a thing she picked, which is not entirely true. She told Danny everything, eventually, over the course of several conversations. Danny listened to all of it. When Claire finished, Danny was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you think it's still there? On the trail?" Claire said she didn't know. Danny said, "Do you think it knows your trail name?" Claire said she didn't know that either. She said she thought about it sometimes when she signed a register. She said she always wrote the trail name clearly, legibly, the way the neat, deliberate hand had written her real name. She said she didn't know if that helped. She had no way of knowing if that helped. Several months after the hike, her phone showed a voicemail from a number she didn't recognize. No area code she knew. She almost deleted it without listening. She played it instead. No voice. Ambient sound. Wind. Or something that moved the way wind moves but had a different quality to it. A rhythm that was almost but not quite the rhythm of weather. And in the background, faint and clear, unmistakable in their spacing, 3 whistle blasts. She sat with the phone in her hand for a while. She thought about calling the number back. She did not call it back. She listened to the voicemail 2 more times to be certain of what she was hearing, and then she deleted it. She said she kept it for a while before that, then she deleted it. She said keeping it felt like answering.